My colleague Peter McHugh and I, many years ago as junior professors, were at Columbia and also around Goldsmith College in London, England, were identified as ethnomethodologists. And we've written over the years, earlier, during that period, let's say, on 3 occasions we've written about our relation to ethnomethodology. And I'm bringing you up to date, those of you who don't know. And the first occasion, I guess, was a motive paper we wrote, the American Sociological Review, around 71. And we said in a footnote, we have about as much in common as Heidegger does with John Austin. Okay. And then, but we were always identified and sympathetic. Let's see, at another point, I wrote a review of Livingston's book in the American Journal of Sociology in the 90s, and I thought there addressed the CAEM division. And then in a book on reflection, self-reflection, the arts and sciences in the 80s, Peter and I discussed Harold in some detail. And you know, none of that stuff was ever commented on by the ethnomethodological community. So if any of you who are younger and interested in renewing that canon are here in the room, I'd advise you to read this stuff, and I hope you will. I want to try to reconstruct the appeal of Garfinkel's work for me in the 1960s, but to do that we have to understand the 60s itself. Ostensibly, the momentum of the 60s was directed against the authority of positivist inquiry and its casual relationship to conceptualization. Its idea that a certain restraint towards desire was required in imagining the human actor as an accessible object of inquiry. For Garfinkel, phenomenology rattled that cage, but influences accumulated from the past and were dramatically personified in Heidegger's conception of Das Sein as a subject thrown into the midst of an inherited set of customs and desiring to care for distinctions in ways more robust and circumspect, and Wittgenstein's capacity to reform this relationship as an engagement of subject to ordinary language in its seen but unnoticed character. These influences, from Plato through Hegel, though unnoticed in sociology, were available and in the air, despite the reputation of such philosophers for essentialism. Acceptance was limited, and even when treated sympathetically, needed to be reformulated in more radical ways by a chosen few. The chosen few figured that the social order could best be examined dialectically through a process of what Freud called Durcharbeitung, where repetitious, ordinary distinctions were worked through and returned, as Freud was to say, in inverted form, analysis always bound to distinguish between its work of reflection and the reflectiveness of the subject. Post-structuralism was eventually to develop such differences that at the time could only be confusing to sociology. Garfinkel emerged as an uneasy figure in this terrain, alive to many such influences, and yet wired to expect scientific progress and a degree of fulfillment as objectives commensurate with the immortality he imagined as the right of a founder, stamping his every present moment as either success or failure, as invariably driven by expectations that could force upon him an edible experience of lack, deprivation, and the fear of castration. To discuss my relation to the 1960s of my generation and its relevance to ethnomethodology, I must appear to digress and reinstate my comments on my collaboration with Peter McHugh at that time, and I draw freely from the human studies piece I wrote. The prosaic, ordinary tension between quantity and quality registered in university life at the time shaped the environment in which we both were educated at our universities. In his case, UCLA, Northwestern, and for me, Chicago. I met Peter McHugh when we were both assistant professors at Columbia University. My office mate was Emanuel Shegel, and he and I also grew close over that time as colleagues. Shegel from Berkeley, mediated influences coming from the new ethnomethodology that you now call CA, research that claimed to depart significantly from work such as offered by McHugh, my colleague in Britain, and also Aaron Sickrow and Goffman. Manny Shegloff eloquently exposed me to the fervor and writings of Dave Sudnow and Harvey Sachs through much fruitful discussion over the merits of different approaches. But he also enabled me to envision tensions that would eventually arise and would become institutionalized in the movement. And I talked about this in my HAS piece on mathematics. Garfinkel seemed a ghostly paternal figure in word only. That is, a bad father, possessive, paranoid, and protective of an imaginary legacy, spiteful and intemperate towards those intellectually collaborative, such as Sickle, Goffman, and even McHugh. Certainly respected for his founding genius, but an object of reverence mixed with distance, appearing needy, dependent, and tyrannical. Partly this must have been a result of the winds of change that were creating Sachs as a new direction for analysis, represented by his pals Shegloff and Sutton, who seemed to play the parts of litigant and ease. Desire for the affection and recognition of either or Garfinkel and Sachs seemed to haunt the climate of this family, whose united front, presented often it was taken to be the imitation of a rock, could only mask intense concerns for who stood where in this domestic idol. I'm not saying this out of the spirit of sour grapes, for I was treated as a friendly outsider, and by everyone except Garfinkel as a potentially reasonable accomplice. Only Sachs's genius and innocence seemed to pacify the intense emotional turmoil that characterizes coterie of intimate rivals who expressed contempt towards those who were similar but different, and uneasily cooperative towards one another's contributions. Ethnomethodology appeared to satisfy Durkheim's formula of a social movement, mixing its mechanical and organic solidarity in ways reminiscent of a murderous Jewish family. And it's worth noting that these were all Jews, bent on appeasing and distancing themselves from one another. Sachs always appeared as if removed from this play. At that time, Columbia University offered the spectacle of tepid remains from the war between quantitative and qualitative research, translated in its specific way into its mundane view of an antagonism between the claims of what was labeled subjectivity and objective knowledge, a conflict that had circulated in the 50s, especially in my graduate department at the University of Chicago, where the renowned Chicago school that had attracted me to the place was destroyed and reincarnated in another shape as a sanctuary of empirical knowledge. Fortunately for him, or so it seemed, McHugh had better influences. The liberal reawakening of sociology in California and its offshoots. And even I was able to escape immersion in empiricism by picking up bits and pieces of these winds of change that Goulner was later to try to describe in the coming crisis of American sociology. Thank God for those like Goffman and Garfinkel, who modeled for us ways and means of doing sociology otherwise, also pointing us by implication of the limits we discerned in their work to the works of Wittgenstein in particular, and, of course, Heidegger. While these and some of our own students pushed us to reread the Greeks and to treat them seriously rather than as anecdotal. If the winds of change seem to reflect a certain emancipatory impulse of resistance against authority, this opinion leads untouched the renewed relationship to language and to representation, stimulated by Wittgenstein, Heidegger, those such as Kenneth, works coming out of France and other such influences. Without considering these tendencies, the generational revolt could be trivialized as if a reaction to paternalism in the most mundane sense, as a caricature of a dumb but happy hippie revolt in the name of freedom, glossing in this way the emphasis on a renewed relationship to the desanctification of language, and so a new conception of the relation of discipline to freedom in speech itself. For example, while McHugh and I were in London, we tried to reformulate the opposition between old left and so-called new left as a dispute over signification and the analytic status of this opposition. Without considering the emphasis on a renewed and disciplined relation to language, this revolt could be neutralized as if it was a bromide that reflected the pacific attempt to humanize positivism and its discourse, say in the way commercial banks began making Friday a day to wear sports clothes. Of course, the university, as today, bought into this. An even more important basis of the solidarity between McHugh and I was our sense of the limits of the professionalism that was affirmed in the discourse of the university as the professorial life idealized as the exemplary model of being. This led us to be hypersensitive to pretense in our ways, in our pretentious ways, making the gravity of the university and its solemn dedication to the manner and means of its micro-world always appear queer. The 1960s were then appealing to us because the influences in the air could only challenge this model of gravity. And here I speak not only about music or Pinter or Godard or Leroy Jones or Cleaver or the Black Panthers, but of the energy in circulation. With our students, Stanley Raffel, who's one of the plenary speakers, was first encountered at Columbia University. He was a McHugh student. He took a course I was teaching in the sociology of mental illness. With our students, our relationships, and with ourselves together, Peter and I began to have a great deal of fun. The relationship of work to pleasure, to desire, and enjoyment was the order of the day. In his interview before his death, Jacques Derrida restates the contribution of this generation to the discipline of social inquiry. And I quote, permit me, "To be faithful to those associated with my generation, to be the guardian of a differentiated and yet common heritage, can mean two things. First, to adhere, sometimes in opposition to everyone and everything, to certain shared exigencies. I'm referring here to an ethos of writing and of thinking, an intransigent and incorruptible ethos without any concession, even to philosophy. An ethos that does not let itself be scared off by what public opinion, the media, or the phantasm of an intimidating readership might pressure one to simplify or repress. Whence the strict taste for refinement, paradox, and aporia. This predilection also remains an obligation. We are talking about a provisionally bygone era and not about such and such a person. It is thus necessary to save that or bring it back to life. And the responsibility for this is today so urgent. It calls for an unrelenting war against doxa, against today those who are called media intellectuals, against a general discourse that has been pre-fermented by media powers. One must develop them and help them to diversify and recall them to some responsibility. Well, what this generational mood tells us is that technology, or as I'm calling it, techne, at that time could as well stand for the mind as a tool of liberation, which equates reflection in the 60s to a relationship with the imagination, an example expressed in Kenneth Burke's notion of equipment for living. This figure of speech focuses on its character as apparatus because Burke's strategies serve in his frame as tools, providing a bridge to Lacan's notion of the imaginary as itself a basic and rudimentary tool of problem solving, as in American pragmatism. The use of this strategy, the imaginary conception of a self and its trajectory, shows how the equipment can originate as a tool and can yet risk being converted into a machine through standardization, making the tool originally liberating as a tool, and corruptible as the mechanization of the machine might produce. Jennifer Bajorek discusses this tension between tool and machine in her work, and I make use of it here with the help of this version of the imaginary as a strategy for problem solving. In that review I mentioned in the AJS, I implicitly use this contrast of technology as tool and machine, as liberation might stand to contrast, as a playful way of encouraging the opposition between ethnomethodology and conversational analysis. Yet as a tool of liberation, thinking makes observable the orderly character of action, not only in its methods and procedures of composing the action, but as McHugh would say, of defining it in its situation, or as Goffman, as presenting the necessary illusion of a self in the action. To paraphrase Kierkegaard, instead of being productive about the weakness of the practical actor, we might seek to enhance the strength of practicality by recovering its interpretive capacities and linguistic resonances in desire. Recoiling from such a possibility, yet seem to be required by the mandate of scientific progress, leading to Schedloff's attribution of deficiencies to Goffman's conceptions of ritual and face as necessary to purge if they were to lay the grounds for the science of social life that he was to imagine. That is, in the early work, definition and presentation became part of the orderly accomplishment of the social, and the need and desire for such production, the conception of an actor oriented in need and desire in excess of the accomplishment of order, insofar as any order must confirm the need and desire for its accomplishment. Coming alive in practice is a trace of what Simmel calls the ought, perhaps not quantifiable in that way, but certainly observable in the discriminating and partitioning of definition and in the affirmative, self-affective gesture of presentation that Lacan, for example, would certainly point to as the jouissance of ethnomethodology. Thus, in the 60s, for those such as McHugh, Goffman, Emmanuel Levinas, Hannah Arendt, Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, Ronald Lang, and J.P. Sartre, an order that ethnomethodology was soon to disavow. The order produced included distinctions such as the situation, the self, defining, presenting, dividing, and various ways and means of identifying, repeating, and associating and partitioning under the sign of the ought. And as for this ought, we might note Herbert Marcuse's association of beauty with the liberating image in California in the 1960s, leading us to ask how Garfinkel stood in relation to beauty, if it shamed him, as he often seemed to imply, or if he secretly coveted. In other words, what is the status of the libido in ethnomethodology? Or should we fear to ask because any answer cannot depend upon consulting its representation as a naturally occurring phenomenon? Garfinkel's work in particular inspired a way of reading texts or practices, texts as practices and practices as texts. Basically, he centered the notion that intelligibility is a practical accomplishment, irremediably measured by the figure of the practical actor. That practical actor had not evolved or devolved to the point it occupied in its late writing as the practitioner. That practical actor, through the notion of member or membership, typified the collective itself as a marriage of courses of action and normative orders, through its vision of social life as an ongoing array of oriented actions. Garfinkel's approach, for me, palpable in my early encounter with it in his text, struck at both doctrinal visions of metaphysics and empiricism. In the place of various jurisdictional disputes, does God exist? What is law? What is the relation between medicine and bureaucracy? It was possible to re-specify such questions as sites at which members' troubles, as expressed specifically in such questions, come to view as oriented accomplishments themselves, as organizations of social actions. Thus, we were freed from the constraint of having to answer such questions, not taught to evade them, but to rethink them as provocations, which, in the words of Baudrillard, put the real on the spot, in the way by inducing the questioning to provide for its own possibility, by accounting for the obviously recognizable character of what it took as settled. Today, for example, academics argue about nationalism in the nation. Does a nation exist? How is it different from the state? When did it come into existence? As if these are empirical concerns requiring us to consult unambiguous matters of fact. Whereas Garfinkel permits us to hear such questions as symptoms of socially organized settings in which members vexatiously seek to work out operating solutions to the problem of boundaries, limits, and the essentially ambiguous problems of is and is not, identity and difference, the same in the other, unity and difference. In saying that the grand philosophical problems are members' problems, that the important problems are always re-specified as member problems, in that gesture, he not merely introduced a translation, but gave us a way of addressing philosophers themselves as practical actors. Not simply when they do ethics or make political decisions, but in organizing their writings as oriented actions. Yet, to recognize the origin of any problem in the effects of the signifier upon the subject and reciprocate it as further effects in usage that we come to see as ordinary language and the conditions of practical action is certainly a beginning but not an end. It is a tension marked by the relationship of and between beginning and end, the necessity here and the ought that needs to drive analysis of this and that makes observable that gray zone of theorizing which we each and all must inhabit and for which we must all develop equipment for living. This inspired me. If theorizing was a member's problem, so too was any practice and opportunity for recovering its very grounds and implications as ways of dealing with irresolution. In this way, we were empowered to appreciate the mundanity of the high and the loftiness of the low. In fact, the emphasis reshuffled the relations between high and low. The august study of ideas recommended the analysis of methods, and the parochial study of social detritus recommended the analysis of interpretive procedures. The division between theory and method started to dissolve, as interpretations and contents were best treated as congeries of methods-oriented actions. The high became the low became the high. Philosophy could be socialized, and sociology had indisputable interpretive grounds. This was a situation for me in the 60s. Oh,
sorry.
Yeah. Oh, good. 5 minutes, the difference between 1 and 12. Michael, let me, okay. I'm an old man. An old man who wants to be young. Okay, the ethnomethodology authorship. I'll finish this for a minute. The poetry in the writing of Garfinkel, buried but alive, and made explicit in Wittgenstein and eventually Hegel, permitted us to appreciate the missing whatness in Garfinkel's writing. That ambiguity could be done by representing it as a trouble, which inescapably and pervasively engaged the collective as an abiding ethical collision. In contrast to ethnomethodology, for my colleagues in Rousseau, our goal in any writing was, in Plato's terms, to produce an unfinished dialectic that by the power of its irresolution could resolutely engage its hearer, could seduce her to fundamental questioning in the face and by virtue of the immediate lack of finality of the writing itself. As you might note, this is a modernization of Socratic ignorance, designed to produce what Baudrillard calls a reminder, a trace, that remains a repast, or what Montaigne calls food for thought. Though this might be a weak solution for conversational analysis, as I understand it, it shouldn't be strange for the best of ethnic. And I might only note comments by Douglas Macbeth, who says of his basketball notes, it can be seriously useful to provide imperfect accounts, useful not as a measure of earnestness, but for hearing differently, though imperfectly, the sense we intend for our words. Well, this resonates with the tradition, with what Gardner has called productive misinterpretations. If we understand what he calls imperfection, not as our lack, but as a sign of the notion of perfection lacking grounding. In other words, as Lacan says, it's the lack that lacks. Yet the unfinished dialectic has to be measured by some conception of eloquence, and it's this that ethnomethodology as an authorship contributes, but only at its best. Such writing, this is my punchline, so I have to finish. Such writing must be more than epistemically fastidious, more than energetic or bombast that impels or compels, but a manner of enlivening, because the essential element of such writing seems to be its guidance by a sense of its own limit and immersion in circularity. It's here that we begin to introduce the notion of an aesthetic relationship that can orient to and reflect upon prose that both subjects language to analysis and is subject to the conditions of representation that we inherit with language. Here, the subject, animated by the desire for self-objectification, both subject and object, both together and apart, reveals for us the authorial engagement with self-development as a kind of affective involvement in the staging of the writing, enjoying the framing as if a sense of enhancement or of adding values in ways both part of and apart from speaking as a naturally occurring phenomenon. I won't do this long quote, but Balzac talks about this as elegance. The novelist Balzac, as elegance. And he says what the elegance is a way of kind of adding, well, investing or giving poetry to things. Investing things with kind of poetic drive. Now, giving poetry to things makes reference to enhancement, exhibited not as decorative, but as an embellishment that can add value. That's all that was talked about previously in the discussion between the exchange Galileo and Aristotle and the Jouissance that was impossible for one to imagine the other. This is kind of the exchange we're talking about. So the potential for elegance or jouissance is part of the commitment to the quality of things, how the naturally occurring and the sensible can be seen through the gift of eloquence to be invested with meaning. In this aesthetic relation to the commonplace, the reflective relationship to the techne of language, we begin to imagine the soul of the signifier, the surplus intrinsic to the word, as Galileo began rethinking the soul of time and space. I propose that the tension in a reflective relationship to authorship comes to view as the inescapable effort of author to reflect upon the circularity, not by breaking free, not by terrorism, but by exhibiting it as the limit of both oneself and all of the others, revealing how a thoughtful participation in common speaking can be exhibited and enjoyed, and how this author, in particular, can show such a path by enacting it in prose. How might we imagine such a writing in action? I suggest first that the data exists in the writing and its practice in both Garfinkel and Sachs's works, if we read them as making reference to making reference itself, as demonstrating in their writing its dependency upon the very resources that their observational science forecloses, revealing their literariness in a most spiritual sense as the gift and magic of ethnomethodology. Second, I suggest that Goffman's paper on footing, ostensibly about how speech frames and stages its own methodicalness, that he illustrates vividly through the example of the lecture, such as what I'm doing here, can be translated into a conception of the drive of writing to exhibit its two-sided membership blissfully, neither only as a handicap nor a virtue, but as a way of reveling in its eloquence, as the human means of reiterating a reflective relation to language considered now as a technology. Now, here's Derrida again in his pre-death interview. If I'd invented my writing, I would have done so as a perpetual revolution. Okay, I suggest that the war against doxa, affirmed by Derrida, is not waged in the name of the science that ethnomethodology seems to hallucinate as its objective, and whose cause even Garfinkel and Sachs appear to enroll in, as much as in the writing of these men themselves, and in the seductiveness of their literariness. That is, the war against doxa is not waged by describing the beast as in Plato's caricature of the sophist who observes its moods and inclinations, but in the art of Garfinkel and Sachs that seeks to form the member, the practical actor, the reader, in the subversive writing that they each, in their singular ways, developed and exhibited as parts of a distinctive, reflective relationship to language. Language is itself a technique, can and should be treated as both a naturally occurring phenomenon and as more than this in Simmel's sense, in the same way as these authors showed respect for their own writing. And it is this desire that for me has distinguished ethnomethodology at its best. So I've been trying to show how innovation is ever possible for theorizing if the theorist takes an active interest in renovating a canon that probably goes as far back as Mencius. Certainly not by purging its aesthetic drive, but by reshaping it in any present as equipment for living. So to summarize, I've tried to provide news, as Garfinkel would say, in three ways. First, I've honored the conference theme by reformulating the relation of reflection to technology, by reframing technique as language itself and the human subject as a tool using subject. I've done this in a way that makes the reflective relation to such equipment akin to the imaginative engagement and to its convolutions, what Lacan calls the imaginary. Secondly, I proposed of such an imaginative practice that it can be understood as the doing of literariness, which at its best reveals reflection as a commitment to engage its own circularity with pleasure and without shame as a researchable opportunity, as Garfinkel might say, both as a topic and a resource for analyzing the topic. Finally, I've suggested, playfully of course, that Goffman's paper on footing might be revived to begin thinking of writing as a methodical struggle to stage its own eloquence in a way that is both naturally occurring and more. Last paragraph. I've even offered a bit of a formulation for those who've been able to hear it, starting with the reputed division within ethnomethodology between its EM and CA parts. I've worked through the schism as a sign of the persistent tension created in the drive for eloquence of poetic elaboration to moderate the desire for scientific finality as an anxiety that recurs in any system of knowledge. In identifying adaptations to this collision in the works of Garfinkel and Sachs, I have suggested use of their respective writings as symptoms of their efforts to solve the problem of fundamental ambiguity through an impossible dream of purging the circuit of poetry from the ethnomethodological sensorium. Thanks for your patience.